Hey folks, those of you who listen to my channel outside of the month of October, and more of you should do that, please, those people know that this was a rough year for me. I lost my mother in July, and soon after I had a chance to see my pick for number 4 on the countdown 28 years later. I know it's not a favorite of some, but this one hit me just at the right time. It resonated with me at a moment when I was feeling my lowest and needed some kind of clue as to why we live and why we eventually die. So while it wasn't my favorite of the year, it was one of the films I saw this year that hit me the hardest. This is M.L. Miller Frights, and this is my countdown of the best in horror, 2024 through 2025. 28 Years Later was released on June 20th, 2025, and available on demand on Amazon Prime from Sony Pictures and Columbia Pictures. It's directed by Danny Boyle and written by Alex Garland. 28 years ago, the rage virus spread across the UK like wildfire, causing anyone who came into contact with it to turn into a snarling, sprinting monster, spewing blood in all directions in order to spread the contagion. 28 years later opens up with a young boy named Jimmy, hidden away with other children in a small home. Soon it is obvious the infected are at the door and rampaging through the house. Jimmy escapes and flees to a church where his father, a priest, welcomes the infected into his church, believing it is God's plan. Jimmy witnesses his father's demise and escapes carrying a golden rosary his father gave him. Cut to 28 years later, and we're now in a small community on an island off the coast of northern UK. The only connection with the mainland is a land bridge that only appears at low tide. The dystopian community gives everyone a role to play in keeping them protected and thriving. Jamie, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson, is a hunter who ventures into the mainland to scavenge for supplies and thin the herd of infected who may attempt to infiltrate the community. His wife Isla, played by Jodie Comer, suffers from an unknown ailment and is bedridden. Jamie decides that even though he is only 12, his son Spike, played by Alfie Williams, is ready to learn to hunt, scavenge, and kill his first infected. The first half of 28 years later deals with this learning and bonding process between father and son. But this is only the beginning of Spike's journey to manhood as he encounters the landscape that has evolved with the virus for the last 28 years. There's a lot going on with 28 Years Later, and I'll try to cover as much as I can. Looking back on this series, the films were always much more than just your typical zombie film. And yes, I know many like to distinguish the threat in the 28 Days Later franchise as the infected instead of zombies. But even in 28 years later, the term zombies are used, and these infected people are no longer there. So while I understand the distinction, I will put the franchise in the zombie subgenre of horror. If you don't, that's cool, but I do. The franchise has been more than just zombie survival. The first one seemed to be about hope after a time of crisis. There were absolutely horrifying things that occurred in 28 Days Later, but it ended on a very positive note. Jim and the crew had survived the horror and were hopeful when an airplane passes overhead. There seems to be some kind of end in sight to the horror. If this were a 9/11 allegory, something quite a few zombie films were at the time, it was director Danny Boyle at his most optimistic, a time where hope may be on the horizon. Then 28 months later came along, and it was apparent that our response to the tragedy was to basically nuke it from orbit. The heavy attention to military, while also showing how a family, even the most loving ones, can betray one another, showed a more pessimistic view. Our baser instincts took over, and instead of searching for a cure, which may be out there in some that have an immunity to the virus, the preference by the higher-ups to destroy rather than investigate prevailed. Of course, despite many desperate efforts by the military to contain the virus, it still persisted. spreading to France in the final moments. That was not such a chipper ending. It's pretty bleak if you ask me. That brings us to 28 years later, and as with the previous two films, the opening moments tells a lot about the themes explored in the rest of the film. 28 Days opened with a well-intentioned humanitarian effort to free chimps tested in labs, causing an outbreak, and ended with a positive note for humanity. 28 Months began with an act of betrayal for the family and ended in a failure of the military to fulfill their promise to protect. 28 Years begins with another family attacked and a boy witnessing its destruction with his own father, who he followed devoutly, showing some misguided beliefs. 28 Years opens with the boy Jimmy going against his father's word in order to survive and does not embrace the infected attack. This is basically the story we see play out through the rest of the movie, with Spike as he learns from his father, then has a moment where everything he believed was true, in actuality, is a lie, forcing Spike to take action on his own and seek answers when his faith in his father is lost. The first half of 28 Years Later is as intense as it can be. We are introduced to the fragile society, marked with signs and lessons everywhere, reminding the community that all the resources are everyone's and not to waste it. Water is portioned, food is free, everything is shared as long as the rules are followed. While many would look at this as some kind of socialist political statement, I don't know if that's what Boyle, writer Alex Garland, and this franchise are going for. This is still an anti-war message continued from 28 Weeks, but I also think they're saying that militaristic action is a necessity as well as being ugly, as represented by the inclusion of the amazing reading of the poem Boots by Rudyard Kipling, over a montage of society through the ages taking brutal military action in order to persevere. On a side note, while the Boots poem is amazingly edited in the trailer and through the 28 Years Later film, I have to give the Horror in the High Desert franchise credit for using the poem first in a horror movie. The terrifying poem shows up in the final moments of the first film and again evokes sheer terror. Back to the 28 Years Later, Boyle, Garland, and the film seems to show that in order for a society to function, both Hawk, militaristic, and Dove, compassionate, attitudes are necessary. Then again, I'm basing all of this on my experience with American politics. Being set in the UK, Boyle might have an entirely different message about his own government across the pond. Sadly, my knowledge of politics outside of the US is limited, so I may be way off with my analysis. Most likely, I am. Boyle has said in interviews that 28 Years Later is about family, and when I heard that, I automatically thought about the kumbaya sort of family message we often get in Hollywood movies. But sorry, Vin Diesel, that's not the kind of family 28 Years is all about. I think Boyle and Garland are telling a more realistic, pessimistic, and somewhat nihilistic message of how a child grows to an adult, and in order to do so, he has to leave his mother and father behind. Typically, one learns survival from the father and compassion from the mother. The amount of what one gets from each parent shapes the child into the adult the child becomes. At least that's the way it's been believed for many, many years before we got all smart and modernized. This is true in 28 Years Later as Spike learns the skills of survival from his father, but still has the naive dreams of a child encouraged by his mother. As his mother, Isla, lies sick in bed, Spike is taken a bit too early by his father to perform these more brutal trials to become a man. Most likely, if Isla were more present, she would have told Jamie to go fuck himself and wait until the boy is older. But she isn't, and Spike and Jamie go out into uncharted territory. I love the way the landscape has evolved in 28 Years Later, the way nature has taken over most places, covering houses and stopped trains with vines. The film definitely is more expansive than any other zombie film has depicted this post-apocalypse before. The threats have evolved too, with the infected basically becoming feral humans who have shed their clothes and sprint after anything that moves. Some of the more out-of-shape infected have become human slugs, slithering across the forest floor and eating anything that they come in contact with. They aren't exactly slow zombies, but they are an added threat as they move silently and are just as infectious and hungry as the fast ones. But the biggest and most terrifying threat are the alphas, giant infected man-mountains, all hair and muscle, towering over the rest of the herd and somehow leading them. These monsters have some form of higher intelligence, and though they are nothing like Romero's Bub from Day of the Dead, they are a bit more aware of their surroundings and are more intuitive to spread the virus and maintain their own survival. This first half wonderfully establishes that the threat has grown and added new life to the already treacherous landscape. Boyle takes his time adhering action to the lessons Jamie teaches Spike as they traverse the countryside and rotten buildings in the first half. While we've seen the threat of the infected before, never has it been so diverse and more dangerous. While Boyle and Garner is telling us a poignant tale about a father teaching his son to be a man, this is also an intense and action-oriented way of introducing this new world to the audience. The film makes a dramatic shift midway as Spike realizes his father's teachings are important, but also much of it is sullied with false bravado and outright lies. The first half is marvelously edited and filled with big-budget action sequences that really got my heart jumping. It never got to the point of where it was during the In the House in a Heartbeat sequence in 28 Days, but a few scenes, like the land bridge sprint sequence, came damn close. This is when 28 Years turns into a much more somber and thoughtful piece about life and death, and while I understand why mainstream audiences might not take to that, I felt this is where the film becomes so much more than your typical zombie survival flick. This is a bold move for filmmakers, as you always risk losing the audience when there's a tonal shift mid-movie. But like Full Metal Jacket, with its intense and its most memorable first half, the second half tonal change is what completes the message Kubrick is trying to tell, and I think the same goes for what Boyle and Garner are going for in 28 Years Later, which doesn't shift that tone once, but twice. It's a wonder anyone was still with the film by the end, and I think that's the reason many of those who dislike the film hang their hat on. The threat is consistent with the infected, but our understanding of that threat changes, and along with it, so does the character of Spike. In the latter half, Spike rejects his father Jamie, pulling away from him and sets out on his own. He's not quite a man, but Spike knows enough to understand he doesn't want to be like his father and chooses to take action on his own. And this, my online friends, is where it got personal for me. It's also going to be very spoilery from here on out, as if the first half wasn't. I lost my father at the same age as Spike does in the film. And yes, I know Spike's father doesn't necessarily die, but when he leaves the island community behind and looks to find someone to save his mother, Jamie might as well be dead to him. It is right here in the film where I couldn't help but identify deeply with Spike's magical thinking that at the end of his noble quest lies the treasure he desires, to get his mother back. But again, this is a mythical concept of family, like the Hollywood tales. There's no knight in shining armor rescuing the princess. This section focuses on the cold, hard fact that everyone racing around infected was once a human being, with loves, thoughts, dreams, wins, and losses. This message is communicated through a wonderfully soulful performance by Ray Fiennes as the iodine-covered Dr. Kelson. Kelson has built a monument of skulls of all of the infected he has encountered, a task that has made him an outcast among the rest of the community, but one he has dedicated his life to. It's with Kelson that Spike learns that every life is precious, even the infected. Now, Boyle and Garland do a lot to pull on the heartstrings here. You've got the sick mother, the wide-eyed kid you followed for more than an hour. Then there's the amazing cinematography with the skulls piled into a tower, a golden sunset, and an overwhelming swell of music. While the threat is still present, the film takes a moment to slow down and acknowledge one single death in one especially gracious act of letting go. Sure, it's surrounded by the sprinting infected, rampaging alphas, and sluggish crawlers, but the moments Boyle gives Spike to come to acceptance of his mother's fate were some of the most touching you're going to see in a horror movie ever. It's a bold choice for Boyle to end the film in this way, especially after the pulse-pounding first hour, but in doing so, his extensive examination of death and how it affects different aspects of humanity with this series has been some of the most sophisticated ideas that are rarely broached in this genre. Seeing this scene hit me hard, more so than I could have imagined, and more so than I really like to express in such a public place as a theater or in an online review. But watching this young boy say goodbye to his mother struck a chord very close to home, too close to my current situation with my own mother. I want to go on and talk about the way the film was shot using multiple iPhones, but honestly, while the shots looked amazing, especially the way the film shifts its focus and slows down the moment, sometimes even freeze framing for a bit, that could be looked at as flashy bells and whistles anywhere else, but in a movie series that has never looked conventional, it's what I expected. I really know very little about camera lenses and screen formats and the like. I'll let other, more knowledgeable people discuss that. All I know is that everything looks unique, but that has been another constant factor through the 28 series. Boyle not only made a movie that hit me like a Mack truck, but turns out it looked pretty nifty too. I also want to acknowledge the wonderful performances. Aaron Taylor Johnson has become one of the better leading men in movies right now. Here he plays a flawed man, trying to do his best to raise a son that will be able to survive in this harsh world. It's a rather one-note metaphorical performance, as he does represent the aggro tough guy, something that this movie and Spike doesn't necessarily want to become, but he does the role very well and gives him much more nuance than the character deserves. Like Johnson does with fatherhood, Jodie Comer plays more of a symbolic aspect of motherhood, representing compassion and morality. Through half of the movie, she is delirious and bedridden, but aspects of both why Jamie was drawn to her and why Spike is fighting for her come through in the latter half. It is a selfless role where she too is not put into the best of lights at times, but Comer makes it her own. And again, while Ralph Fiennes is more of a representation of a lesson Spike needs to learn at this point in his life and in his journey, he always offers up a confident performance as the outcasted doctor. His sincere performance is mostly expository, but the words he speaks resonate and shine. Lastly, the performance of Alfie Williams as Spike was one that had to grow on me. At first, I was annoyed with this child actor. I thought he was the weakest part of the beginning, but then I realized his awkwardness and reluctance was purposeful. Like his character Spike, Williams grows as a character and ended up growing on me too. In the final dramatic moments, the little actor really does a fantastic job, showing real change since we met him in the beginning. Oh yeah, that ending. Another tonal shift from a meditation on mortality to a balls-out, almost slapstick farce with a blonde-haired, track-suited gang of thugs leaping to Spike's rescue against a herd of infected. I know only bits about the Jimmy Savile controversy. I know he was a despicable man who did heinous things. I also know that this probably resonated differently in the US, with most audiences oblivious to his crimes. But even without at first understanding it, I felt this shift in tone was mostly done to usher in the next chapter of the 28 Years Later franchise. Some might feel it undercuts the tone of the film, but I needed that cathartic laugh out loud moment after the second half ended, and I can't wait to see where this versatile series is set to go next. I don't want to get all preachy or anything, but in a genre where death is so common, sometimes we become jaded upon watching one person after another murdered by the slash of a serial killer or the claws of a monster. I know not every movie needs to make every character precious. I love the 80s where people fell like bowling pins, but 28 years later made me take a second and look at death a little closer. The fact that this horror genre, a genre that many look down upon, can make me feel such strong emotions is part of the reason why I watch horror to this day. 28 Years Later is the zombie movie I needed at the time I saw it. My mother allowed me to watch all of those horror movies as a kid. She helped form the lifetime horror file I am today. For that, I am forever in her debt. Rest in peace, Mom. I love you. Another sophisticated look at death this year came from one of horror's greatest ever directors, David Cronenberg. While I feel his films are leaning more and more towards drama these days, which is why I didn't include this film in my main horror countdown, still, Cronenberg's newest film deals with dark themes that are at the very least horror adjacent. Worth noting today is The Shrouds. It was released on April 25th, 2025, and is streaming on the Criterion channel and available on demand from Amazon Prime, from Sideshow, and Janus Films. It's written and directed by David Cronenberg. After his wife Becca, played by Diane Kruger, died of a lengthy stint with cancer, industrial documentarian Karsh, played by Vincent Cassel, played part in developing the Shrouds, a new technology which envelops a recently departed loved one in a 3D mapping cloak which allows the deceased left behind to see the body under the ground going through the natural decaying process. Karsh then expanded this technology, offering up to others, and eventually developed his own cemetery featuring the SHROUDS viewing system, specifically coded to only be seen by the departed's loved ones. But after the cemetery is vandalized, Karsh begins to suspect there's some kind of conspiracy afoot involving mechanical implants placed inside of his wife during her cancer treatment that he discovered while obsessing over his wife's decaying body. This conspiracy is furthered by Becca's sister Terry, also played by Diane Kruger, her ex-husband and co-creator of the SHROUDS technology, Maury, played by Guy Pearce, and Sue Min, played by Sandrine Holt, who is the wife of one of the doctors who worked on Becca's cancer treatments. So therein lies the mystery of whether or not a conspiracy exists, who may be behind it, and whether or not Karsh should give a shit about any of it and just get on with his life. Morbid? You betcha. The SHROUDS is a thorough examination of death, dying, what happens after death, and the grief one goes through having buried a loved one. Cronenberg has been asked if the film was a reaction to the death of his own wife by cancer, and while he says that this was the inspiration for the film, it took on a life of its own and is not some kind of autobiographical piece. It also is not quite horror, though it does deal with the way we all face that great unknown in our own twisted ways. I have to admit this film hit me. I encountered death at quite a young age, as my own father lost his battle with cancer when I was 12 years old. And while there are some moments I don't remember since it was a considerable amount of time ago, the description Karsh gives about how he felt when his wife died resonated with me on a level I wasn't expecting. Not only was Cronenberg able to put it into words, and actor Vincent Cassel able to bring the emotion to life, but this story really touched me in the delicate way it probes into man's greatest fear. In the end, this is one of the more uplifting films Cronenberg has ever made, believe it or not, coming to a very mature yet optimistic end despite how morbid the final images are. As usual, Cronenberg drops this very human story into a world that is maybe a few years, but more likely just a few months away. I could see this manner of burial actually becoming a real thing. Karsh drives around in a Tesla, which in itself has become ironically funny these days. Karsh has an avatar on his phone that basically acts as his own personal assistant, a His Girl Friday or a Money Penny, if you will, who digs for information, investigates these various conspiracies for him, and basically manages Karsh's day-to-day business. Cronenberg identifies the absurd aspects of our technologies today and takes it a half step further. Honestly, I want one of those personal assistant avatars on my phone to help me keep all of my things in order. And most likely, someone's going to see the SHROUDS and make this very thing a reality soon enough. And most likely Cronenberg will not get any of that credit. On top of all of that, the SHROUDS is quite funny. Not in an overt, over-the-top way, but the film is filled with gallows humor, and I couldn't help but laugh at the absurd way Karsh bumbles through his life rather cluelessly and follows the advice of everyone around him, each of them having their own strange conspiratorial-laden explanation as to what is going on. I do feel this darkly jovial tone was intended as not just a means to let loose some of the tension and darkness in this morose subject matter, but also to highlight how humans use humor as a coping mechanism when faced with dire circumstances. The SHROUDS leaves a lot unexplained. I feel that those looking for a complete story with all of the answers are going to feel a bit befuddled when the credits roll after the abrupt final scene. I found myself wondering, is that it by the end? But still, I'm bouncing this film around in my brain long after it's over. It hit me on a visceral level. It's dealing with death, and no one knows what that is. So how can we come up with an answer for it? Cassel's refined and almost monotone delivery, not unlike Cronenberg's distinct delivery itself, makes for a protagonist you can basically project anything onto. He's nothing but grief, preferring to gaze at his rotting wife rather than move on. Still behind that stone, almost alien-like exterior, Cassel is able to communicate the fear and fascination death embodies so well that you can't help but sympathize with the guy. Still, the bulk of the heavy lifting in the SHROUDS goes to Diane Kruger, who plays 3 roles, that of Karsh's dead wife Becca, her sister Terry, and finally Honey, the avatar on Karsh's phone. Each role is distinct, each role is sensual and sexy in their own way, and each role is equally tragic. Yes, even the story of the Avatar has a deeper meaning than acting simply as a digital personal assistant. Kruger is unbelievably versatile in these roles, and while I knew these parts were all played by the same actress going in, on sight, I doubt many will notice it's the same actress. And while his role is much less attractive and downright despicable at times, Guy Pearce gets a chance to show his creepier side, and creepy it sure is. With the Shrouds, Cronenberg's still got that gift for peeking into the future that dazzled us with Videodrome back in the day. Cronenberg still feels on the cusp of uncomfortable subject matter, unafraid to venture into places people are afraid to talk about, and willing to look at today's society and where we are in our intimate relationships with technology to bring forth a highly emotional story. But is the Shrouds horror? Well, we get to see what being in the grave does to a body. Honestly, there have been times I've wondered about that after all this time, what my father looks like down there underneath all of that earth. That's a pretty morbid thought, I know, and I don't think I would have acknowledged it had I not watched The Shrouds. So there are some quite horrifying themes the film plays with and will bring out of you if you've experienced death in your life. There's also some patented body horror in terms of how Becca's body is being destroyed piece by piece from the cancer and the treatments. That is downright terrible to watch. There's an especially intimate scene between Becca and Kirsch that honestly almost broke me at how viscerally real it all was. While body horror has an elusive meaning, I feel what Cronenberg really is a master of is how he brings to life the utter and absolute horror of having one's body become a stranger, and in one particular scene, he illustrates that point perfectly in The Shrouds. And of course, there's the overlying blanket of conspiracy that Kirsch delves with throughout the entire story. So put all of that together and squint a bit, and I think you could make a horror movie out of The Shrouds, though thriller is probably the most accurate genre it falls into. All that said, I feel that The Shrouds is more of an intriguing film delving into ideas, feelings, and societal trends. It's a thought-provoker, a conversation starter, something you discuss with others when things get quiet, intellectual, maybe a little drunk, and deep. All the while, I feel the sudden ending, the answers left undealt with, and the ethereal meaning of the whole damn movie is going to turn off a lot of folks. It's not a typical narrative, but Cronenberg never was a typically narrative filmmaker. I don't know if I would label The Shrouds as entertaining, at least not in a mainstream sense, as there are quite a few lulls in this morose yet beautiful story, but man is it a film made by a filmmaker that got my brain working in ways few other movie and movie makers can. As always, feel free to agree, disagree, or how about you play along at home and give me your own picks for your own favorite movies of the year. It's October, so let's talk horror. Come back tomorrow for the next level in the Best in Horror Countdown. Be sure to hit all of those pertinent bells and whistles down below, and you'll never miss a post. Happy Halloween, folks.